questions you have to ask in thinking about this from the very start. One is what you call a use. What does it mean to be a use? Is residential a fine enough category, or should you break that down into studio apartments, live-work apartments, family housing, and those all constitute different uses, or is that all just residential? So one is, what do we define a use? How do we define use? And the second thing is, and this everyone talks about, what's the scale of the mixing? At what pixel do you fragment the different uses and put them together? So, if you're 10 miles out, you look at any city, it's mixed, right? If you colored each use a different color, the way planners color their maps, there's orange and yellow and red and blue, just in any city you look at. But I think, the question is much more interesting when you get to a finer grain scale. And because zoning has been the model for how we operate in cities since the 1900s, beginning of the 1900s, when the first zoning laws came into place, we really only made very simple zoning maps, which were plans separating uses. So often what we're talking about when we now talk about is, can mixed use work? We're really talking about hybrid buildings. So it's mixing in section, not just in plan. That's an interesting set of questions too. How do we begin to design cities in a complex three-dimensional way? General zoning really came about to protect residential land use from industrial, noxious incursions. So zoning, for the most part, is a protection for the land values of residential, which is an ironic thing to think about, because basically that's the beginning then of this coloring of the city, as if it was a paint by numbers kind of deal, that if you have this many blue dots next to this many yellow dots, in the end you'll get a figure that's the city. Now the industrial land here in Los Angeles is threatened by residential development, because all of the old manufacturing sites are becoming more interesting for loft living and downtown mixed use, basically. But the city's now concerned, as I think is happening in other cities as well, about how to preserve some of that industrial land, because it's always a higher and better use to go to residential, right? Because you get a lot more money back per square foot than if you're doing manufacturing or industrial buildings, which generally go to lower value land outside the city now, but was part of what the inner city was about in the 19th century. So all of that land is pushing to become mixed use and threatening their industrial possibilities. Where if you wanted to start a small company, would you do that in Los Angeles now? You'd have to do it way outside the city fabric. So I think it's an interesting second stage of developing the mixed-use city in a way. Maybe that's beyond what you're thinking about, or it's not the problem that Swedish towns are facing now, but it's a problem that comes with mixed use. As a city becomes a popular residential, commercial, active living zone, it pushes other kinds of land uses out. So the reverse of what happened after the war, which was to push residential uses out and to have the industrial die. Now the residential coming back in and killing the industrial in a way. So you, in the end, have to think about how you might preserve what kinds of industrial uses also. And I think this goes to this thing I was saying earlier, which is when we talk about use, we use that too categorically as residential, industrial, commercial. And really within industrial is particularly apparent that certain kinds of industrial uses go fine with downtown commercial and residential uses. Small startup businesses, or some computer software capabilities, or different other kinds of live-work arrangements. Whereas, hard manufacturing definitely doesn't fit well with those uses. So you have to start defining carefully. I think the interesting next challenge would be to try and rethink zoning, however, so that it doesn't become this absolutely formulaic response to a set of rules that get more and more complex over time, right? That's the natural way that city zoning and the mixtures of uses evolve, is you start with something simple and then you realize that that's not quite the answer, so you start to make it more and more complicated, and over time it becomes so complicated that it becomes unworkable, right? I'd say our zoning code is just about there, because mainly what you see now is everyone applying for variances, right? So on any particular site, your zoning code tells you exactly what you can have, which doesn't fit what anyone would want to build. And it's like, you know, a contortionist act to fit into the envelope or the suit that's been designed for that particular area. And so then you have to go before planning review boards or city councils to say, this doesn't make sense, here's what we want to do. And then they have to find a justification to give you an exception. You know, that whole process now is a little bit backwards.